So I believe we're at a point where we could start. What do you all think?
I realize it's time, sorry.
Okay, so I guess I'll formally open the second LPC annexation meeting. It's February 22nd, 2021. Maybe we should start by examining the minutes that Melanie took for us. Thank you, Melanie. I personally feel they capture what we talked about. I mean, there were a bunch of details that probably we don't need to try to capture in these minutes quite yet, but I thought that did an adequate job. Anybody have any issues?
No, do we need someone to move to?
Yeah, I was just going to ask. I mean, I guess can we get a motion?
I move to adopt the minutes as prepared, and with a big thank you to Melanie.
Second.
And okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, and that means I guess we carry the minutes unchanged. Super. Maybe the best thing to do, Melanie, I know I didn't get back to you to say yay or nay on a presentation. I know you asked to, for a copy of that presentation you'd sent me a while back. We can do that, but I think I'd rather have the discussion before we get into that presentation. I'd like to sort of see what people think about the different aspects that we were charged with reviewing. Maybe I'll start with my piece if you don't mind, because I'm just going to put this out here. I was assigned density, and I struggle with talking about density in the context of this whole thing. Actually, let me put it this way. I would suggest that the density, there are a couple minor adjustments I'd like to make to the density calculation having to do with what is or isn't in what I call the yield calculation, and maybe there's a better term for that. But ultimately, whatever we do with density, I think, is tied more particularly to the other two things you other two had to do, right? It all depends on what we do with open space and what we do with clustering. Of course, those two things are intimately related. So I don't see how we can keep them mutually exclusive terms. I think they all support each other. Having said that, I guess I'm going to, maybe Janelle, you could pull up the code where 179.50, the cluster development code. Actually, let me, before I get into the details, when I went back and looked at the minutes, we were first to examine the language of the district characterizations in 179.43.1 and 43.2. And maybe it's worth a moment just to say, do we want to keep both the AX-Res and the AX mix together in our minds as we're going through this discussion, or do we want to separate them and talk about one at a time? I'm open to ideas here. I think maybe because we've had experience with AX-Res, I've been thinking about all of these more in the terms of AX-Res. I think I can make the jump to AX mix and keep it all together at once, but what's your pleasure? In terms of talking about density, in terms of talking about open space, in terms of talking about clustering. What do you all think?
I had thought that that at the last meeting we had said we were focusing first on res.
Maybe we did, and
I just misunderstanding. I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
Because I think
my feeling is it might be better to just do the res first and then come to the mix. And the mix may take less time because we've dug into some issues with the res. But I think if we're toggling back and forth, I don't know. I just feel like it may as the newbie, it may be a little more confusing for me, at least.
I agree with that, Melanie.
Fine, that's good for me.
Okay. I just want to make sure that we don't forget AX mix. And I
Yeah.
have to say, in reading through everything that I believe represents AX mix, there are some gaps that we're going to need to fill. But more on that later. Okay, so focusing first on AX res. You know, if we were to pull up 179.50, the cluster option, actually, again, the 179.43.1 AX res districts, I think it's the third item in that list. I mean, we read through them the other day. Provide opportunities for residential development in areas not currently within existing city boundaries to be annexed into the city in accordance with adopted comprehensive plan policies. To conserve open land, including those areas containing unique and sensitive natural resources such as woodlands, streams, floodplains, wetlands, by setting them aside from development. And I hope we spend some time talking about that. And the third one is the one that I think is the most intriguing of this entire, well, the last two actually. Provide development options for landowners which minimize the impacts on sensitive environmental resources, reduce disturbance of natural and cultural features, and conserve scenic views. And then providing greater design flexibility. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but that third one was the thing I think that I particularly found myself using to sort of frame what I was considering about density and the other two things. So if we look at 179.50, the cluster development, code. I'm having trouble with my computer today. Janelle, maybe there's a way you can pull up the screen. Is she here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. I don't know. Yeah, there we go. Okay.
So I copied it into a Word document so we can edit it as we go.
Oh, super. Okay. So,
and cluster does also include the AX mix. So if we're going to amend the cluster, we're amending kind of for everything.
So, okay.
Just
okay. Well, that's fine.
Okay.
The first thing that I would like to look at is the density calculation. And to me, that starts with what I'm calling a yield calculation. Is that a fair way to describe the total area of the land minus the tidal wetlands, minus the tidal streams?
So
I mean, what do you call that?
typically a yield, well, that's just your density. That's how you just calculate your density. A yield plan has a tendency to kind of set your density, the number of units you can get onto a property without like clustering. So you'll see that in the R2 for lot averaging. R2 says you can reduce your lot size, but your overall number of units is based on the density. You have to design a subdivision based on 10,000 square feet, even though you can mix and match, which I think sometimes can actually hinder the ability to get that creativity and that flexibility for design process. So I think what you're looking at is just the overall density, how you calculate the density for the development.
I guess maybe I had everything that you just said in mind. This was the first step in determining that sort of starting density figure. How many lots could you develop in a conventional scheme? And then the idea is using for example, the clustering approaches. You can take that number of houses and arrange them in certain ways with certain flexibility, certain reductions in lot dimensions, and so on. I mean, and in that table, the dimensional requirements, clearly there are opportunities to increase the number of houses. Particularly, I think it's in cluster option 2. But I just want to start with this piece, and for some reason, maybe you can help me here. I'm having trouble getting that screen. I want to be able to look at that screen that you just put up. How do I've got them. Okay, there we go. Okay. the basic formula, one of the things that I found myself wondering is, given that we've gone through this process with the wetland buffers, if we should be subtracting the wetland buffer areas from the calculations at the front end of this.
I think that could be very contentious and litigious. And also, I think if you start reducing the number of units you're going to get on a property, you're then impacting the design flexibility. Because they
Why
already
is
have to
that?
provide a buffer. It's just if you let them count, because remember that the buffer is going to be open space. So then are you going to take out open space from the calculation of density?
Well, I have a rather, we're going to talk at some point about traditional neighborhood design, at least in some of the research I've done offline here, trying to understand the way others are dealing with this issue. Some folks would suggest that the open space calculations in this sort of clustering scheme should come after all of the sort of unbuildable pieces of the land have already been removed. And I don't have that off my personal table here. We can get more into that later. But it's a topic for discussion. I mean, basically, we can't build in those areas. Here we are, right away, talking about density, and already we've raised open space. That was exactly why I've never been able to keep them all separate.
Janelle, why do you think that it's a litigious issue? I think it would be a regulation like any other.
I think it could be litigious because you're taking land that you have not determined. It'd be kind of difficult to be. I could see some people thinking it as if a taking. And I also think you need to provide, you guys have said throughout your comments, you want to provide some flexibility.
Mhm.
I think if you're setting I'm trying to think. My brain apparently has not had enough caffeine yet this morning. That if you want to take out, space you cannot use, that protected those wetland areas, something of a specific that there is no value, you won't ever be able to build on it. But then if you start taking out, it's like, well, then we want this percentage open space and this percentage open space. You start providing less and less land to start with and less options to be flexible with when you're starting to design. And I think that just could pigeonhole you into something you may not want. And I think
why those two things don't necessarily, I guess I don't really see how, this determination of what is or isn't included in the overall calculation of density, how that restricts the kinds of parameters for design. That comes later. That's all other stuff that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. I'm not sure I understand how at this point, I mean, yes, the smaller percentage of the overall tract that you allow to be developable, at a high level, it restricts the number, what can be built there. But at this point in the AX res or AX mix, where the gross tract area minus area of tidal waters, area of tidal wetlands, it's not saying anything about the design flexibility.
No, but your density always ends up in impacting your design flexibility. Nancy, you had something?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think whether you include it or exclude it here, I mean, there are like multiple ways to skin this cat depending upon what your objective is. Including it in here doesn't mean you can't build on it, does it?
Yes.
This is just a calculation for the base permitted residential units. It isn't
Right.
saying the areas you can or can't build in.
Right.
And then
And
secondly,
it can still count as open space.
yeah, and then secondly, even if you know, and it's not saying whether you can or can't count something as open space. That's under the open space definition.
Right,
So
but you
think
have to go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think here the real discussion is, like, what's your objective in changing this? Is it that you are concerned that we're permitting too many residential units to be built? In which case you could change just the, you know, the calculation itself. Is it that you don't like where we're permitting them to be built? Well, to me, that's another regulation. Like what's the concern is, you know, or
You asking me, you asking Janelle, but I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I hope when I'm done speaking and the two of you describe what you've seen, at least the way I look at all of this, whatever density calculation, whatever numbers we put in this initial calculation, what really should matter in all of this are the hows that follow, the ways that we qualify how that density is to be built on the property. If we're just going to say it can go wherever, then that there's no point in having a cluster. You know, a whole bunch of rhetoric about clustering. To me, clustering is all about having more discipline about where you're putting things and how you're putting things.
Yeah.
And that's that design flexibility stuff. It seems to me we have an opportunity, and I always assumed having these different cluster options that as you sort of create these more dense options, the flexibility comes in the dimensions of the lots and the setbacks and things like that. It's, you know, we're allowing the same number of houses or even more houses, but we're squeezing them into more specific areas, trying to keep them together to try to conserve larger portions of contiguous open space. There I am again, talking about density and open space in basically the same sense.
I wonder if to maybe just have a very kind of, you know, begin at the very beginning approach. I wonder if it might not be helpful for each of us to take the areas we reviewed and reflect back on 47, the list of the 4 purposes for all of this, and say the degree to which, when we looked at the regs, whether we thought they were supporting or not supporting those purposes, or covering or not covering them. You know what I mean? Like,
okay. Yeah.
And because in part what I'm thinking is, if we each kind of have a light overview of all the areas, then it'll be easier to link them together on a deeper discussion.
Right. So maybe I shouldn't go first, because I can't do density until we have the arrangement of that density.
So do you want me to kind of?
I actually think it might be better if we do my part and Melanie's part first, and then come to yours, because yours is the most interlocked. And I'm happy to go first, you know, looking at open, because mine in a sense is a little bit more, I don't know, self-contained, not completely in any way, but I don't know. Or do you want to go first, Melanie?
No, go right ahead. That's fine.
Or do you want me to give an overview of both?
What do you mean? Overview both?
So
both what, 43.1 and 43.2?
Of the purposes, it seemed like the purposes kind of made sense to everybody, but in the clustering, we needed to break things out a little bit more to reflect the purpose, is what I got from reading everybody's comments. Does that sound about right? Is that like the purposes kind of were making sense, but it's like what we needed to dig into is, how do we get that design flexibility? Because again, the purpose is just says we want to provide design flexibility. The cluster ordinance is how we get there.
I actually thought that, sorry.
Go ahead. And like, you know, we need to talk about open space and protect open space, but we really need to define open space, which is not what you do in the purpose. That's a definition we need to add. Which I know Nancy brought up defining usability, and I think what we can do is with a definition of open space, say this is what it is, and then go this is what it's not. So you can kind of get the usability of the open space and the open space all in one definition, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually thought though that I think it's maybe a little bit more than just the definition, in that I don't think when I was going through open space against the 4 stated purposes in 197-43.1, I didn't think that that all of the purposes actually were being addressed in open space, even though they would seem relevant. So
why don't we get started there?
Okay.
Nancy,
Okay,
roll it up.
Okay, here's what I did. I looked at everywhere where we talked about open space, and went back to the first, compared it to the 4 stated purposes. The first one, opportunities for residential development, thought it was consistent. No comments there. Second, conserve open land, and I'm doing an abbreviated, I'm not reading the whole purpose, okay? So the second purpose around conserve open land and environmentally safe, sensitive areas. My concern here was I didn't think it, and in it, it talks about one of the criterion is that 30% of the open land be adjacent to existing or planned open areas such as public parks, wetlands, or other preserved open areas. But when you look at the purpose, it talks about conserving lands that contain unique resources such as woodlands, and nothing in the open space guidelines talk about those unique resources. And, you know, part of it is I'm not sure we've really defined what is a unique resource. I mean, you know, it shouldn't be totally in the eye of the beholder or we'll be in trouble. So that's conserving environmentally sensitive areas. The third purpose was providing development options that minimize impacts on sensitive environmental resources, reduce disturbance of natural and cultural features, and conserve scenic views. Now, nothing in there in terms of, you know, the 30%, et cetera, says addresses in any way natural and cultural features or scenic views. So
nothing in the details later on, you're saying?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I totally agree with that.
Open space details. And yet it would appear that the way we defined open space would be one opportunity to actually protect those and preserve them. Then design flexibility, I'm not going to go through, I think people are familiar with what the criteria are around open space, you know, permanent, contiguous, 30% usable, et cetera. I'm not going to list those. But when I looked at the comp plan, the open space criteria are consistent with what the comp plan recommends. But when you look at protecting environmentally sensitive areas, again, that's referenced in the comp plan, but the open space, I don't think right now adequately addresses that. But the biggest comments I have are around usability and the definition of open space.
I'm intrigued by what's bothering you about usability. I probably share some of your concerns.
Yeah. So let me go through my concerns about usability. And I looked online, I did some research on how other jurisdictions define usability, et cetera. And I pulled out 1, about 6 different aspects that are addressed by many other jurisdictions in defining usability that we don't seem to have in anything about open space. One would be limiting the dimension. Basically, some say no dimension of the open space can be less than X feet. So that,
sorry, there's shuffling going on. What was that? No dimension what?
no dimension of the open space can be less than, fill in the X feet. So this gets around this issue of you're going to have open space that's contained in, a 2 foot wide piece of land that extends for, a long distance, but really, unless you're a very thin person walking heel to toe, you're not going to be able to use it.
So I went searching for some of this same stuff. You're talking about the shape, the geometry, the arrangement of open space through the property.
Yeah, these are all things that go into kind of criteria being used or the definition of what counts as open space. A second would be that no slope in the space can be greater than, Y percentage. So that your open space isn't something that you could only use if you were rolling on your side along it. Third would be that it's readily accessible. And I think this probably requires a lot of discussion in terms of, what's meant by accessibility. Or are we really thinking of open space because reference is made to conserving a view, and in that case, a view is accessible just with your eyes, Next area would be the area be designed for outdoor recreation, landscaping, viewing, or sitting, and some specify that, where you're actually listing some of the ways in which, what would define use. Fifth would be include no obstructions, and whether you're allowing play structures, benches, fountains, and landscaping on the open space. And especially in terms of structures, how many structures do you allow, and what many limit the percentage of the open space that can be occupied by structures. So I also would note that, MNCC ranked the action item of open space requiring meaningful, usable, communal, recreational open space as a high priority, and in their comment said, agree completely, should be easy, just amend the definition. So,
But we don't have one.
We'll get that all worked out in the next couple of minutes here, and then we can get
our marching orders. Okay.
But that's exactly why, Nancy, when we did the reports in the planning commission meeting the other day, I offered us up as someone to start that process. Mm-hmm. We've got some work to do.
Now, our current definition of open space is land or water other than lots, streets, and sidewalks set aside by the developer and so arranged to permit ingress, egress, or passage over and through the area. So right now, our definition, if you have, a big water pond or an area that, because of the way it's designed, actually can't be used, but is there for water retention, for stormwater retention, all of those would count. I looked at the open space development model ordinance at the EPA site, and I can read that to everyone if that would be helpful. It's a portion of the development site that is permanently set aside for public or private use and will not be developed. Open space may be used as community open space or preserved green space. And green space is defined as open space maintained in a natural, undisturbed, or revegetated condition. So most seem to use a kind of short definition, but then have a lot of criteria around, the slope, the maximum dimension, those things to kind of provide a more operational definition.
Well, Nancy, one of the things in the various examples you've just given, one of the things that popped up in my mind is disturbance. I know when we talked about the wetland buffer ordinance, there was talk about, are we leaving things alone, or are we just making sure that whenever site prep work is done, that it is restored or replanted or whatever? And I think one of the considerations somewhere in here has to be, how might we further limit the disturbance of a natural area? Because
So
you don't necessarily get back what you've destroyed when you replant it. But that's that I'm just sort of throwing out maybe as a parking lot item. It just came up as you were talking.
So I think there's a couple of things. We can look at a definition of open space, and I know in a lot of places who have definitions of active and passive open space,
Yeah.
and you have to have percentages of both, because like a lot of new residential developments are going to go have that clubhouse and that pool or that gazebo and those benches, so or a pickleball court or something like that. So I think, and we want to encourage some of that, but we also want to encourage the preservation of woodlands. And of course, you can't touch the wetlands anyhow. And now we have a buffer around the wetlands and what can and cannot happen in there. So I think there's, that would all be the passive open space. And, we can always look at percentages about both, or just defining them that you have to have a mixture.
You're saying we could actually specify X% of the open space needs to be reserved for passive or whatever.
Correct.
Okay.
You could, yes. I'm not saying that's the way to go. I'm just trying to give you ideas, start thinking. Stormwater management ponds usually get counted if you have an active or passive. They get counted towards your passive, because usually you'll have like a nice walking path with benches. So that ends up being more of a passive, because a lot of people like to watch the geese that you don't want landing in them. Or in another development where they put a fake alligator to keep the geese from coming. So there's a lot of different things that you typically, how do you calculate that? And of course, your wetlands buffer and your wetlands would be counted towards your passive. If there's concern about woodlands, maybe looking at, you have to protect so much of the woodlands. And if you can't, then you're replanting woodlands at a higher percentage. So it's like, okay, and I've seen this done because I know it came up in a couple of places about woodlands and protecting the woodlands. Like, okay, woodlands definition, you can clear up to 60% of the woodlands on the property. If you go beyond that, then you're planting 1.5 trees for every tree that you take out, something like that, to make sure that, and that happens on site. So just something like that are all helpful ideas to kind of get thinking about that. Which is why, how you define things comes back to play. Melanie, I know you had a question.
Yeah, not a question, a comment.
Comment.
I think thinking back on a recent project that we looked at where the open space was all stormwater management, there really was nothing that was usable. I think perhaps we should limit how much the stormwater management can count towards open space as we are going to limit it. The second idea is perhaps we require that a percentage of the open space be central to the development so that it's not just all peripheral open space, but something that's inside the development that creates a focal point or a community area. And I think that would be a really good way to see better design in the annex res areas.
And I think that's where your requirement for active recreation can come into play. Because if it's all passive open space and you don't have any active open space, then you get that item that you were talking about. But also recognize sometimes you don't always have that amount of room. So maybe there's relief that can be provided by like, an offset, a fee in lieu to like the Parks Department to help provide additional amenities for if you can't provide that active.
I want
And
to second what Melanie said about the stormwater thing. I mean, in some of these stormwater designs, you have these basins with these steep slopes. Coming back to Nancy's point about slopes, we don't tend to have steep slopes here, but we create them every time we build storm basins. And you can see examples looking around the area. I mean, are they safe for children to play in, for example? Should children be playing in them? I think that's a good point that she made.
Yeah.
I'm personally not a big fan of a high proportion of open space in a given parcel being stormwater practices. So I'm looking forward to seeing how we work that out.
yeah, and I think with Melanie, your suggestion of having some of that open space central, it links to with kind of accessibility. But we have to keep in mind there is a trade-off, because the open space that's typically positioned at the edges of the property is usually making contiguous open space with neighboring properties.
Right.
But it also sometimes gives kind of a perk to whoever's unit borders on that. And so you have, within a cluster, desirable ones and non-desirable ones. Whereas if you still have some level of open space that's centrally located that everyone can actively use together, I think there's a real value there. After doing all this, I just wanted to mention, I kind of raised 4 points for discussion, okay? One is, and I think we probably all agree on this, is that the code should include a definition of open space. And I didn't point out when I read to you what it currently says, that is a definition of open areas, not open space. And while I'm not a lawyer, I do like consistency. And if you're going to define something, I would hope it would be a word that's being used in the code and, actively being considered. Then I think the second big issue then is, should the open space be usable, how we're defining that, whether, the location, the slope, all of those things. And the third big issue that came up to me was, and this is, my opinion, or a question that was raised is, as we've defined it right now, does it sufficiently address the stated purposes that we had in those 4 of conserving lands that contain, unique resources such as woodlands, and reducing disturbance, as you've brought up, Sumner, reducing disturbance of natural and cultural features and conserving scenic views and protecting environmentally sensitive areas. I think we have to use that lens to look at this when we're reviewing it. So those are the 3 big things. Let's get a proper definition that actually says open space and not just open areas. Let's spend some time talking about what's usable and how we're going to define it. And then the third is, are we really doing enough to address the conservation, preventing disturbance, et cetera, portion of the purpose?
I think this is excellent, Nancy. With the usable piece, at least every time I've ever looked at open space as it's used in planning discussions in Lewis, in Sussex County, I always wonder for whom. I always wonder for whom are we protecting this open space? Is it, whose open space is this? When we're talking about sort of the pattern of the adjacent open space, as you were talking about a minute ago, Nancy, that sounds like it's for more than just the people that live within a community that's being developed here. When you talk about the interior stuff, that's largely maybe a community specific open space. Should there be some balance between stuff that's sort of publicly relevant, valuable, versus what's internally valuable and relevant? It's something I constantly struggle with when we're trying to look at these plans. Anyway, I just want to throw that in there.
And, one thing I didn't mention, I think we also need to think about the space that, isn't central, but is kind of on the periphery. There is a tendency for whoever has a unit or something that personally faces on that, there's a tendency to start in some ways acquiring it as your space by putting your bench on it, your this on it, your, sandbox on it, whatever. And I think it becomes confusing for the public if you're walking down a trail. You don't know, is that a bench I can sit on or I can't sit on? Is that, I think it's useful to proactively address those kinds of issues.
Yes, and from decades of experience, that will happen no matter what we do. And unfortunately, that then becomes not a city issue. It will become a homeowner HOA issue because the association actually will end up owning that open space. So it becomes regulations it becomes a civil issue. But yeah, we do try to encourage, I know in the wetlands buffers, you have to flag the edge of the wetlands. So, it's like, don't mess with these. And you are required to place property markers, but, sometimes they're about the size of a quarter and, not everybody knows that, like, hey, that's where your property line is, and can find them after a couple of years. But yeah,
Whose job
it
is
is
it to
difficult.
evaluate compliance?
Right. I'm just giving the heads up.
No,
It's
no,
like,
no,
'cause sometimes
I'm
that's
asking
just not always. I'm sorry?
I'm asking whose job is it to evaluate compliance? Does the city have any responsibility there, or does it strictly become an HOA versus the individual?
Oh, it becomes a civil issue. Because if somebody places a bench in the open space, the city doesn't really have the jurisdiction. It's a trespassing issue between the property owners about where they placed it.
But if just as an example, if an HOA permits people to put little storage, those prefab storage units out in that open space, and we start seeing one of those every 10 feet, isn't that an issue between the city and the HOA to say, this was supposed to be open space, we don't permit this type of structure in an open space?
Yeah, hopefully they're getting a permit for that, and we would catch it at the time of permitting.
But those are
we
called
do
accessory
require-
structures.
Right. So if you're doing something like that, you better be getting a permit. If not, then you have an issue because you've placed something without a permit. But then we would send the notice of violation to the HOA and not the property owner. So then the HOA, then the property owner have to get it figured out.
My only point is there may be situations where the city would be enforcing something on the HOA enforces it on their members.
And that has happened in many different places. Melanie.
Well, maybe it's, in talking about ownership, maybe the developer should deed any of the protected lands to the city.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing.
So that's a discussion between the developer and the city.
I'm saying we would require it.
No, you cannot require that. That would
I would think the developer would be happy to get rid of it, and so would the HOA.
So requiring somebody to give land to the city is a legal issue and would be a taking. Cannot require it to do. You can encourage it if it's something like adjacent to a park. It also then impacts their density because they no longer own that property. That property is no longer part of that development. So then you have just cut off the land for how did they calculate that density, because that property is no longer theirs. And I have seen that come up in...
It's post subdivision. I mean, the density is already taken.
Right. It's a question of timing, seems to me.
Yeah.
I have come across many a legal issue about requiring somebody to do that, and unfortunately you cannot, because that is a taking.
So with so many of these issues that I think we're just beginning to, put the balls in the air. I mean, in my mind, there's an array of ways of managing all this. Some of them are strictly sort of regulatory, and some of them may involve more of an incentives approach, it seems to me. I mean, this whole arrangement of clustering options that we have, to me, is a sort of if we do this right, we should be incentivizing a pattern that we imagine best meets the goals of the comprehensive plan, right? Maintaining the biggest contiguous open space areas for whatever purpose they may be used. How do we help developers choose those over just strictly exhausting the space with big parcels? I mean, to me, that's the beauty of clustering. Some of that can be dictating it must be this way, and some of it, I'm assuming we're making through an incentivized system, a system of incentives. A way to get them to choose. We're offering flexible ways to do this, but if you go this route, you'll have these other opportunities.
And I think that's why there's so many different options, is to give that flexibility in those options. Because again, we're talking about how do we get properties to want to annex into the city, so the city has that control of what it looks like when it develops, because you've all said, or at least the city has said, that's important to it. And then how do we keep that and somehow in keeping with the character of the city, while recognizing the farther out you go, you have to find the balance of what 4th Street looks like versus some of those houses on New Road, and then it matches the county. So it's finding that balance of what the development's going to look like, where the development goes, and providing that flexibility is what I'm hearing.
And just to point on that, because one of the things I was thinking about density is that overall density calculation should be sort of a neighborhood based, what's in the immediate environs of this particular parcel, what makes sense. We don't need to be imposing R2 or R1 density sort of calculations when we're in the middle of the city. And we may want to be careful as to what density we're calculating on the outside of the city as well. Like you say, you look at the context, the spatial context of a given parcel to sort of determine what's an appropriate density. But
yeah, that just becomes more difficult. So which is why you just kind of, it's like the AX res just says this is how you calculate your density. Because you have to think about it really, what our annexation areas are. Our New Road, there's some on Savannah, and there's a little bit on Kings Highway. But
each of those areas has differing adjoining zoning districts with bulk dimensions and all those things specified.
And I think that's why there's the options of clustering, because what does make sense there? And it also then provides you to find that middle ground between what's in the city, what's in the county, and finding that middle ground, because maybe what's in the county isn't appropriate and what's in the city isn't appropriate, but somewhere in the middle, which is one of those cluster options is. But you can't create a different one. It would drive the planner nuts, not just me, but any future planner, of trying to figure out what it is. And you also want to provide some consistency so the public knows what's going on. What's going on, because it's like any zoning classification, you have standards, and this is how you calculate something.
Well,
and you don't.
But using that logic, I mean, applying cluster lot option 2 as it's currently configured out on the edge of the city doesn't mesh with the neighbors.
Well, I think we can set some adjacency standards, though, in terms of scale and height and, that kind of thing, to be more consistent, even unit type, so.
And I know a bunch of those, having attended a number of those meetings that the City Council Annexation Committee, where they were designing all of this. a lot of those things were, referencing the county limits. Like the heights, for example, in the AX res are higher than they are in any other district here because that's what the county has.
And again, don't forget, just because we have the AX res doesn't mean somebody has to annex with the AX res. They can annex with the R2. If they wanted to ask for the R4, they could ask for the R4. It's up to council to make that final determination. What the AX res and the mix are doing are providing alternatives to go, okay, maybe this is a little bit more consistent, and this gives us a little bit more opportunity to get that property into the city.
Janelle, is there a way, and again, this may be a parking lot issue, but I'm wondering, again, having gone to a number of those meetings when they were hammering out all of the language that's in here. Tom West, for example, was charged with evaluating, sort of what could be done in the county versus what was being done on the edges of the city. And my understanding of the way, for example, the XRES was crafted and the clustering options that are here, had a lot to do with trying to rectify the differences between what the county was doing just outside our boundaries and what the city did inside the boundaries. With the recently passed superior design stuff in the coastal area, is it worth you maybe next meeting running through the details of what that means and how that might change what we have in the cluster dimensional stuff, because things are different than they were before?
Not for the area surrounding Lewis, they're not.
It's all the coastal area.
Yeah, and they were already subject to the prior requirements.
So was all that a matter of not enforcing what was already on the books? What was all the hoo-ha about?
No, it's more towards, so if you were surrounding Lewis or one of the other towns, there was a different criteria because you were in what was formerly called the environmentally sensitive developing overlay district that you had to do.
Which
and
is
then
now
there
the
was,
coastal area.
which is the coastal areas. So Lewis had to comply with that. And then there was, you go farther out, you weren't part of that, but you still got to do the clustering without having to do some of the other things. So it was just making the cluster consistent throughout the county as to how it impacted the coastal areas and then the non-coastal areas to create a cluster subdivision.
All right.
There might have been enforcement of a couple of design standards, but most of those were pretty standard that the planning commission and the staff were recommending be obtained or complied with.
Okay, so you don't think there's any reason to examine? I mean, we're still going to be looking at all this, but just to make sure that we're looking at the best available description of the county's requirements.
Yeah, my understanding is the density calculation did not change. It was a couple
No,
of
I don't
design
think the density
standards.
calculation changed, but I thought that there were certain aspects of. I'll go back and look. I don't want to waste any time on this right now.
Yeah, I think we
I'll
actually already exceed and have some of those criteria already in our code.
Okay. Okay.
Back on open space, I'm not sure how usually on these subcommittees we advance things, but I'm just thinking that that we need a definition, and we need to look at usability, and we need to look at, are we actually protecting what we want to protect? And would it be helpful for me for our next meeting to pull together, I'm not talking about my sitting in a room alone and writing code, okay? I'm talking about making kind of a more detailed list of what we might want to have in a definition and have in a code, so that we can have a focused discussion on, if we were to limit the slope, what would that limit look like? If we were to, if we wanted to limit the dimension in one dimension, what would that look like? Those kinds of things. I'm just trying to think of the way to advance our thinking and get us closer to,
I think it's a fabulous suggestion.
Okay.
And it might also, if you want to just send me your ideas, and then maybe I can actually put it into a definition, and then I can give you guys like, oh, this is the draft definition or definitions. and then we can start discussing that at the next meeting. So then if you can, give me a heads up, because then I can, because I've also got definitions I've worked with in the past, and there's just some other definitions I have resources to that maybe we pick and pull here and there and put into a definition, and maybe we look at a definition of active and passive and the percentages and those types of things. So we get to, I think, everything you're looking for. But yeah, if you've got ideas, send them to me. I'll put them into some more formal verbiage, and then I think that will keep us moving forward.
If you could send me some of those that you have, especially on like active versus passive and how that's being defined, because I think my thought is this is one area before we move on to Melanie that we could make a plan to keep, making progress on, because once we have the definitions and all of that, the percentage, those are things that will be a trade-off as we're talking about clustering and density and everything else. But first, at least having some idea of how we're defining it, and are we including stormwater drainage or not, and blah blah blah. So
I think the challenge with a lot of that is going to, very quickly we're going to get into the weeds, is in terms of specifying, ratios between all those facets of open space. And I'm not sure how much we can dictate that. I think it's I hope we have a good dialogue on it, but from some of the things that Janelle said, I think we have to be careful about how much we specify about ratios of things. Anyway, I think Nancy, I think that's a great way to proceed. I'm wondering at 11:58 what we want to do. I would love to hear, I know Melanie, you've done work. Do we want to take some time and go through what Melanie's done? Just see where we are. What's your pleasure?
Janelle, do you continue to be available?
Yeah.
Or do you need, yeah.
No, I'm good.
Want to go on? Because it could take another hour.
I'm fine, but it's up to you guys.
I'm good.
All right, let me get my notes up.
Nancy, thank you. That was excellent.
Well, while Melanie's getting her notes up, I asked you this and then I didn't write down the words to use, Janelle. And my apologies that I didn't send my notes out to everyone before the meeting, but I was concerned about what I needed to put on them to say it's just for your review and that we're not discussing this outside of this meeting just because of guidelines. So what exactly do we need to post? Because I think we'll get more done at the meetings if we've had a chance to read, what everyone's done a bit beforehand. So
I think it's just a reminder that, hey, if you're going to send something out to everybody, don't reply all. You can ask me questions and I'll try and respond. If not, I'm going to say, hey, save that for the meeting. But if Sumner, you send something and then Melanie responds and then Nancy responds, we can't do that. We cannot be having a conversation via email, but you can definitely send something so everybody has it. But don't call each other, don't text each other, don't go back and forth via email, because that gets us into a FOIA issue. That's why we have today's meeting.
Yeah, food for thought to be discussed in the meeting.
Yeah, if you're going to reply to everybody, just remember that's for something for the meeting.
Okay.
Super. Great question. Thank you. Melanie, you ready?
Yeah, I'm just having trouble getting on Zoom and having my meeting notes up or my notes up.
Are you trying to share it?
No,
or just having it up?
I'm just trying.
If you try to go out of full screen for Zoom and reduce it to the side, and then you pull up your notes and reduce them to the other side, that's sometimes an easy way of being able to see both.
Or would you like me to share them?
That would be fine. That would be easier. I'm just trying to get back to Zoom now.
Go to, are you on a computer? Go to the bottom and look for the Zoom camera and click on that, and that should pull that window to the front.
I don't see it.
You're saying the first step
Oh,
is to share
yeah.
screens.
I
So
got it now.
you know, you'd have to unshare your screen, right?
No, you can see the comments, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep, we're good.
Oh,
Yeah.
those are your comments. Okay.
Those are Melanie's
Yeah.
comments.
yeah. So
I save everything when you guys send, so I can amend as needed.
So similar to what Nancy did, I looked at the purposes in the comp plan, and it seemed that the one that wasn't met by the regulations is that they do not provide greater design flexibility, at least from my perspective. So I saw that there were possibly two ways to move, and one is just to look at the chart in the current regs and tweak them, basically. For example, the minimum square footage for townhouses could be reduced to 1,800 square feet from 2,000, perhaps smaller minimum lot frontage, and you know, sort of stuff like that, which is fairly minor. Or to allow the developer to propose his own standards in accordance with a pattern book that we could possibly provide for, or at least to provide some outline of what the pattern book would need to contain. This, I think, would be a lot more accommodating to creative design while still allowing us to provide oversight and controls. And then the zoning regs do not offer a definition of cluster development, which is sort of interesting. And a possible definition is that a cluster is a close grouping of houses set off by similar groups by an intervening open space and incorporating a special community facility or feature. So this is, again, overlapping a little bit with Nancy's issues. And we certainly do offer a density bonus in the NX zones. And other communities that do offer that kind of density bonus require that that bonus be targeted to low and moderate income homes. So, you know, it's while it's not a specific goal of the annexation zone, it is a purpose, a stated purpose in the comp plan. And, you know, it could be a very small percentage of the units that would be low or moderate income housing, but it would give us, I think, or it would move us towards one of the goals. Another common cluster requirement is that a variety of housing types be included in cluster. This should probably be conditioned on the permitted cluster or the permitted density. For example, if the proposed development is about 50 dwelling units, then perhaps they're all the same type. But if it's between 50 and 100, then two housing types would have to be provided. So perhaps it's single family and duplexes, or duplexes and towns. So again, that there's allowances there. Let's see, protecting the character of the adjacent development is provided in the regs by adequate transition in density or a 30-foot vegetated buffer. That transition in density is something that we haven't seen yet, but we do see the 30-foot buffer with a berm and or a fence and planting. My personal opinion is that berms are unnatural features of the community because you just don't see them naturally occurring here. And they imply, to my mind, that there is incompatibility between what's being proposed and what's existing. And so if we're trying to move towards better transitions, then perhaps we should depend more on housing types and plantings rather than berms and fences. But that's, again, something we can talk about. And then I think, again, the buffers around wetlands and floodplain areas, we should require to be forested. And certainly, while we know the wetlands are pretty much left alone, the buffers are not necessarily planted, I believe, or required to be planted. And I would prefer to see that become a requirement. If we're offering
to revert it back to
density, then the developer should be willing to do a little bit more in terms of landscaping.
So
Sumner?
Melanie, just on that, let's speak specifically about wetland buffers. You're suggesting that if there weren't, for example, trees in the wetland buffer, you would urge them to be planting trees in the wetland buffer?
If it's, yeah, if it's non-tidal. If it's tidal, trees may not be appropriate. It may be some sort of wetland grass or sedge, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what the wetland buffer ordinance did, was recognize, like, if you're going to have trees, you're going to leave the trees. If you have, sometimes you just want it to go back to a natural area. It limits the number of times you can cut it if it's a grassy area, because we did recognize, I know that subcommittee worked a lot and was like, recognize, like, not all wetlands are planted or have trees, because that's not always the best thing for wetlands. Because like every wetland can be slightly different. So I think the wetlands buffer ordinance addresses a lot of those concerns.
But does it require planting?
In certain areas it does, but in certain areas it does not. And again, requiring trees in certain wetlands is not appropriate.
And
Outside of
non-tidal,
tidal
right?
wetlands?
In tidal wetlands, it's totally inappropriate. But
Right.
in tidal wetlands, you know,
In
so,
non-tidal wetlands. Yeah.
you know, for example, there are areas, I think, along streams within the city that are not tidal.
And I understand that. I just think that is something that the wetlands buffer ordinance has addressed. And I don't think you want to start having conflicting ordinances with each other, because if you're, that would, to me, it requires an amendment to the wetlands buffer ordinance, not to the cluster ordinance.
So along those lines, it seems to me there are pieces of this cluster ordinance that need to be either removed, because there's one that specifically talks about wetland buffers, and it needs to be brought up to snuff with what the rest of the wetland buffer ordinance says.
Correct.
Right now they are kind of different.
Right. And that's what we can do. We can just make sure everything is consistent.
Can I ask a question? What was the thinking behind the 2,000 square feet minimum for townhouses? It just, I mean, you know, on the face of it, it just sounds pretty big to me.
Yeah,
You
sure
know,
does.
as someone who raised 2 children and had a live-in babysitter living in a 1,500 square foot house for many, many years with one bathroom, and we managed perfectly well. It just sounds, I don't know.
It's not the
Huge.
square footage of the house, it's the square footage of the lot.
Ah, thank you.
So when it discusses that, it's not your house has to be this size, it is the lot area per that dwelling. So so if you do like a townhouse set, you have to have at least 2,000 square foot per townhouse set. So you can put, you know, 6 in a row, which means you need to have 12,000 square feet for those 6 units.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, that likes to confuse a lot of people.
Isn't the lot dimension 100 feet deep though?
Let me find that. The depth of the lot could be 100 feet. Yes. That is typically standard.
Okay.
I'm trying to. Actually, the depth is 60 feet. So let me look at a townhouse. Yeah, because it's the minimum dwelling square footage per dwelling unit, which is the overall lot size. It's 25 feet for the lot width, 60 feet in depth is what it is. So it's not 100. Typically you see that on a single family. So if you're going to do the conventional lot, which is the first column, it is 100 feet in depth. But for the detached, it's for cluster option 1, it's 60. For townhouse, oh sorry, it's 60. And then in option 2, it's 75 and 60 are your lot depths.
Actually, the table I'm looking at says the conventional lot minimum lot depth is 150 feet.
Sorry, your lot width. I read the
Yeah.
the row above it, but yeah, it's 150. But you'll see a lot in the city that's 100 is the lot depth.
Okay.
So Nancy, how wide was your townhouse?
Oh,
Or
this
your-
is a single family home.
It was,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, typically the smallest you see anymore is about the smallest I've seen built lately is like 18 feet. They've been building 20 to 32 feet wide for a townhouse.
Right.
But the smallest I've seen lately is about 15 feet, 15 to 18 feet.
So that they couldn't do under the current code, right? Under the current annex.
No, they would have to be building. Well, again, if it's a lot, if it's a condominium and it's not its own separate lot, you can get a smaller unit because again, you just need 12,000 square feet to get, say, 6 units. And you have to have the overall lot frontage. So the end units could actually have more of your lot, and then the smaller the interior units could actually be narrower. But if it's going to be a fee simple, if it's a fee simple lot,
Building condos today, though.
I've actually seen the last couple of years they were picking up steam again. But if they're fee simple, yes, they have to be at least 25 feet wide.
See, that seems really excessive to me.
That is something. That's why we're discussing.
Right.
What are the rules in the count? I mean, I guess the question then always comes back to, from a county perspective, you know, how different are their rules
The county, I think you could go down to 1,600 square feet. And
For a
that's
conditional use process?
Mm-hmm. All townhouses and multifamily were conditional uses unless you were in the C1 zoning district. And that
here
doesn't,
we're making them by right at some scale with
Yes.
some dimension.
yes, because again, we recognize that exists in the county, you know, not too far away. So how do we make that match? Or at least be somehow similar.
Well, by right in itself is a further incentive over, you know, you're gonna have to go through this conditional use process to get what the county does.
And again, our conditional use process is you have to get it reapproved every year, which is very
love that
difficult to
idea.
do for residential development.
So as Melanie's been talking about, both ladies here have been talking about how can we maybe think about even smaller townhomes or whatever. I can imagine the neighbors of said subdivision freaking out. And at least the way I think about this, again, it comes down to the I'll call it, for lack of a better term, the spatial discipline that is imposed in having these much smaller lots, these much smaller buildings on a parcel of land that is likely to be surrounded by other parcels that don't look anything like that. And at least the way I look at it, the much higher densities that Melanie and Nancy were just talking about, and you, Janelle, are easier for us all to, they're more palatable, I guess, when there are significant pieces of open space that intersperse through those higher densities.
And
I mean,
again,
this
that's
is
why the current code, if you do 1, you're at 30%. The higher the density, the different the housing type, the more open space you have.
well, and so it may be that Nancy, what you're going to be working on becomes critical, because I think it all comes down to what we say, what we accept as open space, as we're possibly allowing higher densities. You know, how it's going to work.
Well, that and the transition zone.
Yes. In case I didn't say this earlier, I share Melanie's feeling about berms and fences and things like that. That's this may be unfair, but lipstick on a pig. It's window dressing. We need to come up with more meaningful. Again, there's this word, useful transitions.
And also think about it, if you have single family going to single family, do you need a transition zone? Or does that further separate the same use?
I think, again, it depends on the scale and the height, and, you know, if someone who's adjacent has a 3-acre lot and then we're building on 6,000 square foot lots right next to it, is it necessarily compatible?
So one of the questions that comes to mind for me, given what you just said, is how many of these things can we hard code? Can we sort of specify numbers for, versus we're going to describe goals and we're going to leave it to the developer to come forward with, you know, their idea, and then the planning commission has to review it and say yay or nay. I guess having now served on the planning commission for a while, where possible, I would like to be able to offer the parameters in a clear enough form that we don't always have this dialogue. And maybe it's impossible to get to this point where the developer or his or her representatives are saying, but we're doing this, we're meeting your criteria. We're saying, no, you're not. And so just in the last month, I've come across a number of things, and I guess I'm really interested in this pattern book. Is that what you called it?
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued with this idea as a way of helping us all better understand what it is we're asking for, what it is we're hoping for, versus and also what it is we won't accept. You know, in your experience, Melanie or Janelle, is that possible through such a thing, through a pattern book approach?
It can be helpful. It will not solve all the questions you've had, because it can go, oh, we have a pattern book, we're complying with our pattern book, and it's still not, because again, I have a different version of what I'm thinking, you have a different version, and even though we have a pattern book, it could be like a fourth thing that ends up being built. You can, the zoning ordinance, and again, we as we've discussed, we want to allow that flexibility, so you can't be overly prescriptive. And a zoning ordinance should not be overly prescriptive, otherwise it makes it very impossible to do anything. It's just finding that balance, and sometimes you can find it and sometimes you can't, and that's why you can fix a code. It's like, oh, that's not working, let's go tweak that a little bit, which is I think what we're doing here is, all right, we had a little bit of experience with this, didn't quite get exactly what we wanted, so how do we tweak it to kind of get more of what we want without being so prescriptive?
Right.
And I think there's going to be, unfortunately, there's no perfect solution.
I wonder, Melanie, could you say a few words on, I'm trying to understand like really what a pattern book looks like and how it would be used, and et cetera.
Well, I think it would replace the chart that we have currently.
The table.
The table, yeah, that prescribes lots, square footage, and
Okay.
road frontage and all that, and offers examples of what we want in terms of result. So rather than saying you absolutely have to set back 50 feet from the street, you know, we allow some flexibility there in, you know, and get something in return for that kind of setback. And we show what we really want in a transition zone. And we show what screening really looks like, you know. So, and it might even show, you know, a density of housing rising from the periphery to the center, so that there is good density in the center, but there's more compatibility on the periphery. So, you know, it's a variety of things like that.
And typically I've seen it, the way I've seen it work, sometimes with success, sometimes not successful, is it's a case-by-case basis. So you have an option in your code to do, and it's really more form-based code is what a pattern book is. It's
That was the next thing I was going to ask about.
It's really getting into form-based code, but it's for that development is typically what you see it. So that development then is designed to have a look and feel based on this criteria. And that is a lot of give and take between the developer, the commission, and then in this case, you might work it out between the developer and the commission, but then they've got to work it out with the developer and council. So
how does that work? That working out thing sounds to me like, unless we've put enough out there so that it's clear enough what we're looking for, we run the risk of an owner who's recently purchased a property and has something in mind coming forward with something, and they say, because you didn't have it all out there in front, I believe I'm entitled to do this. How do we prevent? Maybe I don't understand what you've just said, Janelle. It just seems to me like if we leave it all to the dialogue,
well, no,
there's an expectation that a developer or a property owner might have at the beginning of this that doesn't fit into whatever dialogue may develop further down the line.
No, you have like set criteria, but then they have the ability to be flexible with those set criteria. So it's like if you want townhouses, you know, we encourage a flexibility of the pattern book really gets into the design of a development, what materials you're going to use. Sometimes it comes down to, are we going to be alleys, front loaded, those types of things. And then how does that all function together? Where's the landscaping going? So it's a kind of a different way to do it but it's like, oh, you still have to have 50% open space. Your open space still has to have this and this and this, but we're going to give you a little bit more flexibility on unit type, and because we're going to get that extra architectural quality out of it, or we're going to get a little extra landscaping out of it. So you give them a little bit of flexibility, but you also say, well, if you're going this route, you have to do not just A, B, and C, you have to do X, Y, and Z.
Right. I think, I mean, I guess just intuitively, it seems to me, the further we go to the right in the columns and the cluster options, the more I'm hoping that we're making, you know, we're asking for more in return for offering higher density. Is there, it sounds to me like we probably need to have some examples that we can look at and discuss about what pattern book might look like, how it might operate, what form-based codes look like, and so on.
So the one thing you don't want to do is go half conventional code, half form-based code. You go one or the other. And we've already got conventional code.
You're saying across the board for all zoning districts, or just in this code? In the
city's code, you don't want to start mixing and matching. But I think there's some flexibility you can work into the code when we're talking about how do we define open space with, okay, now we have active open space and passive open space, and you have to have so much, you know, has to be one contiguous parcel. You know, the smallest width it can be is 5 feet, because that way you can get a lawnmower up and back. you know, also good for getting a tree in, you know, looking at, maybe, saying we want to provide flexibility in the lot width, but you still have to have an overall lot width for like a pack of townhouses or a couple of duplexes. So you give them some freedom, but also gives them some criteria to work with.
So just on that last point, you're talking, if I understand what you just said, you're talking about something like a lot averaging.
Yeah, you
Sort
could.
of the way Melanie was talking about, from the periphery to the center of a development.
Yeah,
With the
or
overall goal of X being the density or the.
and maybe
lot
that's
size,
something
whatever.
we look at here is some lot averaging, because because right now it just, well, I mean, cluster option 2 lets you go down to 5,000 square feet. I don't know if you want to go smaller than that for a single family house. You could, but that's also consistent with the R4 zoning district in town. I'm not sure
Right.
you want to go less than that, even though there's the Burton subdivision is 4, but that's a, an older development. So, it's finding, and I know Melanie mentioned, it's like, okay, well, at a certain number, you have to start mixing housing types, does that work? And again, remember, the land and what's on the land is also going to dictate the development of the property. Because if you've got a wooded area and a lot of wetlands, maybe that's not best for more intense development. Maybe that's better for the lower density, for the single family. And maybe if you've got,
by the different columns in the tables as we've got them now. I mean, maybe there's
yes,
tweaking, but we've offered those kinds of different options.
yep.
Melanie, I guess I'm curious. Do you imagine there's a way that we could engage some of this pattern book approach without wholesale changing the entire zoning of the city? Is there a way that we can do this?
Well, let me think about what would be included. Okay, and just sort of an outline of what's included in the pattern book. Maybe that helps to give us an idea of whether it will work.
I mean, it seems to me, if the way, Janelle, you've described these AX Res, AX Mix districts as being other options in the whole scheme of zoning districts that we offer for annexable properties, that there should be some way that we could create some of this graphical examples that, sort of a graphical way, a geographical way, spatially disciplined way of offering alternatives to developing in this area without wholesale change of the entire city's zoning code. It seems to me there should be a way we can do this.
Oh, there is. You just want to make sure we don't go cluster development just turns into nothing but form-based. I think you can add things here and there to get you where I think you guys want to go.
So I'm eager to see how we can start to do some of that. I'm not sure what the timing is. I have virtually nothing that I can add from the density considerations that I had that can't be managed by what Nancy and Melanie have discussed so far. I mean, we're getting right into the meat of the issues that I think we should be focused on. I'm wondering at 12:30 how much more we want to try to accomplish today and where we go from here. I thought Nancy offered a great path forward for some of the things that she's doing. And I guess I'm hoping, Melanie, that you would do what you just said, that we'd see how we can explore the idea of some of this form-based
I don't want to go to form-based. I'd much rather stick with
Okay,
the
sorry,
pattern.
the pattern,
So-
the pattern book approach, but just something that provides graphical examples. That's if I
Mhm.
understand what you've described, something that describes graphical examples, something that helps us all better understand what we hope for, what we aspire to,
So
rather than just a bunch of numbers in a table.
So
Yeah.
a couple of items. The only place I know in the area that's using pattern books is the Eden Hill development in the city of Dover. And that pattern book has changed multiple times since its inception. And I think something else to look at is, and it's not really a pattern book, but it kind of gives you different options, is the Historic Lewis Byways management plan for, I want to say Kings Highway, because it goes, because I think that's the one where they've actually done the planning, the design plan for what the road should look like. And that kind of gives you ideas going, all right, this will work here, this will work here, but it gives you to you visually, which is kind of what a pattern book does. And that one's just kind of where the landscaping should go. How do you do the landscaping? Do you do the stormwater management in the boulevard? If you're gonna like, so that kind of gives you the ideas I think you're looking for. And I know that one is online.
I'm smiling because my wife is very much involved in that. And just the other day, we had this conversation about how maybe Byways needed to be making a presentation to the Planning Commission about some of the things that they're trying to do. And I really appreciate what the reference you just made. But again, they found that words didn't adequately do what they were trying to do, and they had to get to graphical depictions, they had to get images, they had to get sample plans, and so on. I will say we haven't talked much about this, but in our language, and I guess it's 17950, there are things that talk about other forms of buffers, and I think there's some work that we need to do there, particularly along the roadway frontages.
Just
And
remember,
I think we should rely, we should see what we can do to work with the kind of the byways approach you just mentioned. I think they're doing some really good work.
yeah, and I think they do also have some different examples again, because I kept bringing it up, like New Road. They're doing the New Road master plan.
Yep.
Not every area of New Road is going to look exactly the same, because it doesn't. So you kind of function like, okay, this portion of New Road is going to look different than the close Nassau versus Pilot Town, completely different versions of New Road.
The
Because you
phrase
got,
the phrase that they use is context sensitive design. That's
Yes.
the flag they're carrying along any of these corridors.
Right.
And it changes from context to context along the given corridor.
Yes. So, but they also had kind of, the reason I bring it up is it's kind of pattern-ish. It gives you those examples. So those are two good ideas. And also remember, the road frontage that we're going to be dealing with for annexation is going to be along a byway. 95% of it is, I'm pretty sure. There is some enclaves in the city, but they're pretty much already developed. So when something gets annexed, it will also have to comply with the byways. Just so everybody remembers that.
Okay.
Okay.
I kind of feel like we're at a good stopping point. What do we need to do for next time?
So we're going to get me ideas for definition of open space, and I'm going to turn that into open space. And I think if everybody wants to take a look at those examples that I just kind of brought up, and then if Melanie's got other examples of pattern books, so we can kind of look at that. So we can touch on, hopefully get a good definition of open space, and then start looking at some of, the table and how does that table work with the ideas we've got going pattern book wise.
Okay.
I think that's good.
And I'll pull together for our next meeting a list of the things that I think we need to discuss in terms of the operationalization of open space, because the definition is one thing, but the definition typically doesn't give all of the details of how you're implementing it. So
There are a lot of, the way I imagine it is there's a number of topics, each of which can be represented by a spectrum of choices.
yes,
It's a
exactly.
many dimensional problem.
Mhm.
All right. I think that sounds good. When are we next going to meet? 2 weeks? Is that good?
What's that date?
March 1st. No, I'm sorry.
No, that's
March
next.
8th.
March
Yeah,
8th.
there you go.
March 8th. Sorry, my calendar got stuck on last week. So it would be March 8th.
That's good.
11 o'clock on Monday.
Okay,
That works for me.
Okay, I will get that set up.
okay.
Super. Thank you very much. Any other issues, things that have come up in anybody's minds that we want to put on a parking lot for later discussion?
No,
Okay,
I
good.
think we've got plenty.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I think I may have said this last time, but as I've been thinking through this all, I can't help but think that what we're sort of talking about here and banging around also might very well be useful in each of us, and as well as the rest of the Planning Commission, keeping some of these issues in mind as we're revisiting the whole major subdivision code, as was also suggested that we needed to be doing in the LPC action agenda. So, I mean, these issues come up, the issues that we've been banging around today, they come up each and every time we've reviewed a subdivision proposal that I've been involved with. And I'm hoping that as we work through this, we may help to inform the broader major subdivision process in addition to what we're doing here with annexation.
Yeah, I think particularly the open space issue, the
Yep.
definition and parameters that we established now really could be applied across the board.
All right, folks, thank you. So 11 o'clock on the 8th.
Correct.
Okay,
And by the way, I'm sorry, Joe Hockner, I'm assuming that's JH, long
Yes.
ago put this thing in the chat, which I just need to acknowledge. Berms are handy to prevent flooding from adjacent non-city residences and roadways. This is the case along New Road. My sense is that's going to be sort of a case-by-case basis based on the topography of the land, of the parcel, and sort of like some of what Janelle was saying earlier about the lay of that particular parcel and how it's configured.
And the Conservation District will figure that out based on best stormwater management practices. The developer
Okay.
and them. Yep.
Great. Thank you, guys.
okay.
Everybody have a
Enjoy.
good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.